He needed a fake wife for 1 week. She needed money. Neither expected the real bishop. The letter arrived on a grey Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the door of the cramped lodgings Honora Blackwell shared with her mother, and it changed everything. She had been mending a torn hem on Mrs. Pemberton's second-best morning dress, squinting in the weak light that filtered through their single window, when she heard the soft whisper of paper against wood. For a moment, she simply stared at the cream-coloured envelope lying on the worn floorboards, her needle suspended mid-stitch. Letters rarely brought good news anymore. The last 3 had been bills, demands for payment couched in increasingly threatening language, and she had learned to dread the sight of her own name rendered in a stranger's hand. But this envelope bore the mark of Dr. Hartley, the physician who attended her mother, and Honora set aside her work with fingers that trembled only slightly. She read it standing by the window, her lips pressed into a thin line that grew thinner with each sentence. Dear Miss Blackwell, I write regarding your mother's condition, which I fear has deteriorated more rapidly than anticipated. The consumption of the lungs has progressed to a stage requiring specialized treatment beyond my capabilities. I strongly recommend consultation with Dr. Edmund Shaw of Harley Street, whose expertise in pulmonary ailments is unmatched in London. I must be frank with you, as I know you prefer plain speaking. Without such intervention, I cannot in good conscience offer hope for Mrs. Blackwell's recovery. Dr. Shaw's fees are considerable. I estimate treatment would cost no less than £40, with ongoing care adding substantially to that sum. I am sorry to be the bearer of such difficult news. Please do not hesitate to call upon me if I can be of any assistance. Your servant, Dr. William Hartley. £40. Honora read the number 3 times, as if repetition might somehow change it. £40, when she had exactly £2, 7 shillings, and 4pence to her name. When the rent was due in 6 days, and Mrs. Pemberton's dress would bring only 3 shillings. When the Aldrich family, whose 3 daughters she taught pianoforte every Tuesday and Thursday, had announced just last week that they were leaving London for Manchester, taking with them the guinea a month that had been the foundation of her precarious income. She looked across the small room to where her mother slept, propped on pillows to ease her breathing, her face pale as the linen beneath her cheek. Eleanor Blackwell had once been beautiful, not merely pretty, but genuinely beautiful, with the kind of delicate features and graceful bearing that had captivated a prosperous merchant and secured a life of comfort. That comfort had vanished with her husband's gambling debts, and the beauty had faded under the weight of grief and illness. But when Eleanor smiled, traces of it lingered still. She was not smiling now. She rarely smiled any more. Honora folded the letter with precise movements and tucked it into her pocket. Then she returned to Mrs. Pemberton's hem, because the dress was due tomorrow, and 3 shillings was 3 shillings, and she had learned long ago that wallowing in despair accomplished nothing. But as she worked, her mind turned over possibilities like stones in a stream, searching for anything solid enough to build upon. She could seek additional pupils, but families wealthy enough to employ a music teacher had largely fled London for the countryside now that the season had ended. She could take in more mending, but her eyes already ached from close work in poor light. She could apply for a position as a governess or companion, but such positions required references, time for correspondence, weeks of waiting, while her mother's lungs struggled and failed. £40. It might as well have been 400. By the time she finished the hem and hung the dress carefully to await morning delivery, a desperate plan had begun to form in her mind. Not a good plan. There were no good options left, but a plan nonetheless. She would visit the employment agency on Cheapside. Mrs. Barrow's establishment was not entirely respectable, everyone knew that, and the positions she placed often required flexibility in matters of propriety. But Mrs. Barrow paid quickly and asked few questions, and Honora was long past the luxury of reputation. Whatever was required of her, she would do it. For £40, she would do almost anything. The offices of Barrow Employment occupied the upper floor of a building that had seen better decades, accessible only through a narrow staircase that smelled of cabbage and despair. Honora climbed it with her shoulders squared and her chin lifted, wearing her mother's good grey dress taken in and updated with fresh ribbon, and carrying herself with the bearing of a woman who had once been welcomed in respectable drawing-rooms. The bearing, at least, cost nothing. Mrs. Barrow was a stout woman with sharp eyes and an unfortunate taste for purple silk, and she looked Honora over with the assessing gaze of a horse trader examining a potentially promising mare. "Miss Blackwell, isn't it? You've come before. Pianoforte lessons, as I recall." "I find myself in need of a more immediately lucrative position," Honora said, pleased that her voice emerged steady. "Something temporary, perhaps, but well compensated." "They all want well compensated." Mrs. Barrow sniffed and shuffled through a stack of papers on her cluttered desk. "Well compensated don't grow on trees, Miss Blackwell. You're too old for nursery work, too plain for—" She stopped, squinting at something in her pile, and her expression shifted to something calculating. "Actually, there might be something. Came in this morning. Most peculiar request. A gentleman seeking a, how did he put it, a temporary companion of respectable bearing for 1 week at a country estate." Honora felt her stomach tighten. "A companion?" "Don't look at me like that, girl. The notice specifically mentions separate chambers and no impropriety." Mrs. Barrow peered at the paper. "Says the lady must be educated, presentable, and capable of maintaining a convincing fiction, willing to compensate generously." She looked up. £50 for 1 week's work. £50. The sum hung in the air between them, obscene in its magnitude. £50 was more than a governess earned in a year. £50 would pay for Dr. Shaw, for medicine, for 3 months' rent, for everything her mother needed, and more besides. "What fiction?" Honora asked carefully. "Doesn't say. You'd have to ask him yourself. The gentleman's solicitor, a Mr. Whitmore, is conducting interviews today. You're presentable enough, and educated too, unless I miss my guess. Good family fallen on hard times?" "Something like that." Mrs. Barrow wrote an address on a scrap of paper and pushed it across the desk. 2 o'clock, if you're interested. "And Miss Blackwell?" She leaned forward with a knowing look. "If the position requires more flexibility than you're willing to provide, you're free to refuse. But if it's all above board, take it. Offers like this don't come twice." Honora took the paper. Her hand was trembling now, just slightly, and she tucked it into her reticule before Mrs. Barrow could notice. "Thank you," she said, and descended the cabbage-scented stairs with her heart pounding against her ribs. The address led to a solicitor's office in a more respectable quarter of the city, though the building itself was modest and the furnishings worn. Honora arrived precisely at 2 o'clock and was shown into a small waiting room already occupied by 3 other women. A flaxen-haired beauty in an expensive dress, a matronly widow in unrelieved black, and a nervous young thing who couldn't have been more than 18. None of them looked at Honora directly, but she felt them cataloguing her appearance, the careful repairs to her dress, the sensible boots just beginning to show wear, the auburn hair pinned with more severity than fashion, but absolute neatness. She sat in the remaining chair and folded her hands in her lap and prepared to wait. The flaxen beauty was called first and emerged 20 minutes later, looking thunderous. The widow followed and departed, shaking her head. The nervous girl went in, came out crying, and fled without a word. When Honora's name was finally called, she had begun to wonder if the entire enterprise was some elaborate hoax. It was not a hoax. The inner office was small and cluttered with legal documents, and behind the desk sat a portly man with spectacles and an air of profound discomfort. but Honora barely noticed him, because standing by the window, silhouetted against the grey London light, was the man who was clearly the source of Mr. Whitmore's discomfort. He was taller than most men she had encountered, with dark hair that looked as though he had been running his fingers through it repeatedly, and features too sharp to be handsome in any conventional sense. His clothes were expensive but carelessly worn, his cravat slightly askew, and when he turned to examine her, his eyes were the colour of winter ice over deep water. Those eyes assessed her with the same thoroughness Mrs. Barrow had employed, but there was something different in his gaze. Not lechery, she had learned to recognize that quickly enough, but a kind of desperate calculation, as though he were solving a complicated equation, and she might be a variable he had not considered. "Miss Blackwell," the solicitor said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit. I am Mr. Whitmore, and this is—" "Lord Ashworth," the tall man interrupted, his voice cool and clipped. "Viscount Thornfield, and I find myself in need of a wife." Honora remained standing. "I was told you required a companion, my lord, not a wife. I am not interested in a temporary wife," he said, and there was something almost like amusement in his tone, though his expression remained remote. "A fictional one, for 1 week, at my family's estate in Derbyshire, to deceive my dying father into believing I am respectably betrothed." The silence that followed this extraordinary statement stretched long enough for Honora to examine several possible responses and discard each in turn. Finally, she settled on, "I see." "I doubt you do." Lord Ashworth moved away from the window, and she realized he was not merely tall, but lean, coiled with an energy that suggested constant motion, forcibly restrained. "My father, the Earl of Blackmere, has perhaps a fortnight left to live. His final wish is to see me married, or at least promised in marriage. I have allowed him to believe I am engaged to a woman who does not, in fact, exist. You lied to a dying man. I spared a dying man unnecessary grief." His jaw tightened. "A distinction that matters to me, if not to you. And now this fictional fiancé must materialize in the flesh. My great-uncle, Bishop Marcus Ashworth, has announced his intention to visit the estate to meet my betrothed and discuss the wedding. He arrives in 3 days. I require someone of respectable bearing, educated enough to maintain conversation with a bishop, composed enough to survive scrutiny, and mercenary enough to accept payment for deception." Honora felt her temper rise at that last word, mercenary, but she forced it down. She was here because she needed money desperately, and taking offence at accurate descriptions would not serve her mother. £50, she said flatly, "for 1 week. £50, separate chambers, a wardrobe suitable for your role, and complete confidentiality in both directions." Lord Ashworth's grey eyes had not left her face since she entered. "The arrangement ends when the bishop departs. You return to London with your payment. We never acknowledge each other's existence again, and my father dies believing his son has secured the family's future. And if we are discovered? Then I face the consequences. Your involvement ends the moment deception is suspected. You leave immediately, with payment in full, and I handle whatever remains." He paused, and for just a moment something cracked in his cool facade. "My father's happiness matters more to me than my own reputation. I will protect you from scandal." It was, Honora thought, a remarkably comprehensive plan. Ruthless in its pragmatism, certainly, and morally questionable at best. But she found she could not summon the expected outrage. She had spent 3 years making morally questionable compromises to keep her mother fed and housed. This was merely larger in scale. "The previous candidates," she said. "Why did you reject them?" The first could not stop giggling. His tone suggested this was a capital offence. The second began lecturing me on the spiritual dangers of falsehood. The third burst into tears when I mentioned the bishop. "I do not giggle. I have few remaining illusions about spiritual dangers, and I have not cried in 3 years. Honora lifted her chin. "I have a condition, however." Lord Ashworth's eyebrows rose. "You are in a position to make demands. Half the payment in advance, £25 before we leave London, the remainder upon completion." She watched him calculate the risk that she might take the money and disappear, leaving him worse off than before. But something in her bearing must have convinced him, because after a long moment he nodded. "Done." He turned to the solicitor. "Draw up an agreement. Miss Blackwell and I leave for Derbyshire tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" Honora caught herself before the protest could fully form. Her mother would need to be told something, arrangements made for her care, but £25 would cover a nurse for a fortnight, would pay Dr. Shaw's initial consultation, would buy time she desperately needed. "I will require the evening to settle my affairs." "Then settle them." Lord Ashworth's expression remained unreadable. "A carriage will collect you at 7 o'clock. Pack lightly, anything you need will be provided." He paused at the door, looking back at her with those winter-grey eyes. "You should know, Miss Blackwell, that I do not expect this to be pleasant. My family's situation is complicated, but I will not require anything of you beyond a convincing performance of affection." "I should hope not, my lord. I am not a very affectionate person." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or reluctant amusement. "No," he said slowly. "I don't imagine you are." And then he was gone, leaving Honora alone with the bewildered solicitor and the dawning realization that she had just agreed to spend a week pretending to love a stranger. For £50, she reminded herself, for her mother. She could pretend anything for that. The carriage that arrived at 7 o'clock the following morning was far finer than anything Honora had ridden in since before her father's death. Gleaming black lacquer, matched grey horses, a footman in livery who handed her inside with expressionless courtesy. She had spent the night alternating between practicalities and second thoughts, arranging for Mrs. O'Brien from the floor below to look in on her mother, leaving £20 with the physician's office for immediate treatment, packing her few presentable items in a battered valise. Her mother, thankfully, had been too tired to ask many questions. Honora had told her only that she had secured a temporary position as a companion, well paid, and that she would return within a fortnight. Eleanor Blackwell had pressed her daughter's hand and whispered something about opportunities and providence, and Honora had kissed her forehead and tried not to think about the lies already accumulating. Now, settling onto velvet cushions across from Lord Ashworth, who had nodded once in acknowledgment, and immediately returned his attention to a sheaf of papers, she allowed herself to examine her new employer more carefully. He was not handsome. She had established that yesterday. But there was something compelling about his face nonetheless, a kind of fierce intelligence in the sharp planes of cheek and jaw, in the dark brows drawn together over those remarkable grey eyes. He was dressed more carefully today, his cravat properly tied, his coat of excellent cut and quality, but he still radiated an energy that seemed barely contained by social convention. "You may stop cataloguing my defects," he said without looking up. "I am well aware of them." Honora felt her cheeks warm but refused to be embarrassed. "I was not cataloguing defects. I was trying to understand what sort of woman would plausibly agree to marry you." Now he did look up, and there was definitely amusement in his expression. A pragmatic one, apparently. "The story we shall tell is simple. We met at a musicale in London. You play, I assume?" "Pianoforte. Competently, not brilliantly." "Competence will suffice. I heard you play, was struck by your steadiness." Steadiness. The word escaped before she could stop it. "Not my beauty or charm?" "My father knows me too well to believe I would be struck by beauty or charm." Lord Ashworth's tone was dry. "He would, however, believe I might be drawn to a woman of practical intelligence and calm disposition. Hence, steadiness." Despite herself, Honora felt something that might have been approval. He had thought this through with considerable care. Go on. We were introduced by a mutual acquaintance, you may choose the name, preferably someone deceased or living abroad. Our courtship was quiet and brief. I proposed 3 weeks ago. You accepted. The wedding is planned for spring. Why spring? Because my father will not live until spring, and the engagement will end with my grief. He said it flatly, without self-pity, but Honora heard the pain beneath the words. You will return to London. The supposed wedding will be quietly postponed and then cancelled, and life will continue. Your uncle, the bishop, will he not find it strange that he never met me before the engagement? Marcus has been travelling extensively missionary work in various remote locations. He has not been to England in nearly 3 years. His sudden return is unexpected. Something flickered in Lord Ashworth's expression. Inconvenient. You sound as though you do not care for him. I respect him enormously, which is precisely the problem. He set aside his papers with a sigh. My uncle is not the comfortable elderly bishop I led my father to expect would give us a blessing from afar. He is sharp, perceptive, and genuinely devout. He will not be easy to deceive. Honora absorbed this information with growing unease. Then why is he coming? If he has been abroad for 3 years, my father wrote to him, begged him to return for the wedding of his only surviving son. Lord Ashworth's jaw tightened. I could hardly tell my dying father that there would be no wedding, that I invented a fiancé because I could not bear to break his heart with the truth. Which is? That I have no intention of ever marrying. The statement fell between them, stark and uncompromising. Honora waited for an explanation, a tale of lost love, perhaps, or some scandal that had soured him on matrimony, but none came. Lord Ashworth simply returned to his papers, his expression closed and forbidding. Very well. She did not need his secrets. She needed only to play her part convincingly enough to earn her £50. The rest of the journey passed in near silence, broken only by stops to change horses and take refreshment. Honora watched the scenery transform from London's crowded streets to open countryside, green and rolling under the grey autumn sky. She had not left the city since her father's death, and she had forgotten how beautiful England could be when one escaped the soot and noise. By the time they reached Derbyshire, late afternoon light was slanting golden across hills dotted with sheep, and Honora found herself almost peaceful. Almost. Then the carriage crested a rise, and she saw Ashworth Hall for the first time. It was enormous. That was her first impression, a sprawling stone edifice that seemed to grow from the hillside itself, all towers and gables and endless windows catching the dying light. But as they drew closer, she began to see the cracks in its grandeur, the ivy that had grown wild over the east wing, the shuttered windows, the gardens that had clearly once been magnificent, but now showed signs of neglect. The house was not crumbling, not yet, but it was tired, worn, like a great lady fallen on hard times, holding herself together through sheer determination. Honora understood that feeling intimately. The estate has been struggling, Lord Ashworth said, following her gaze. My father's illness has consumed most of our attention and resources these past 2 years. I have been making improvements, but slowly. It is beautiful. He looked at her sharply, as if suspecting mockery, but whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him. It was my mother's favourite place. She used to say the house had a soul. Where is your mother now? Dead. 15 years ago. His voice flattened. As is my brother, 10 years ago. I am all my father has left. Before Honora could respond, the carriage rolled to a stop before the great front doors, and a flurry of servants emerged to attend them. She had a brief impression of an elderly butler with kind eyes, a housekeeper in crisp black bombazine, footmen and maids arrayed with the precision of a small army, all watching her with undisguised curiosity. And beyond them, framed in the doorway and clutching the arm of a young footman for support, stood an old man with Sebastian's grey eyes and Sebastian's sharp features, softened by age and illness, but blazing with a joy that struck Honora like a physical blow. "My boy," the Earl of Blackmere said, his voice cracking, "you've brought her. You've finally brought her home." Lord Ashworth Sebastian stepped forward and embraced his father with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything Honora had observed of him thus far. "Father, you should not be out of bed." "Nonsense! I would not miss this for anything." The Earl pulled back, his trembling hands still gripping his son's arms, and turned those eager eyes on Honora. "Miss Blackwell, my dear Miss Blackwell, let me look at you." Honora approached and curtsied, her throat suddenly tight. She had prepared for scrutiny, for suspicion, for the need to perform. She had not prepared for love, this desperate, radiant love that shone from the Earl's face as he looked at the woman he believed would make his son happy. "My lord," she said softly, "I am honoured to meet you at last." "Honoured?" The Earl laughed, a thin sound that dissolved into coughing. When he recovered, his eyes were wet. "My dear girl, the honour is entirely mine. Sebastian's letters spoke of your grace and intelligence, but he failed to mention how lovely you are." She felt Sebastian stiffen beside her. His letters. Of course there had been letters. How else could he have maintained the fiction of an engagement? "My son is not given to flowery compliments," the Earl continued, threading his arm through Honora's and beginning to lead her inside. "But I see he chose well. Come, Mrs. Bradley has prepared tea, and you must be exhausted from your journey. Sebastian, see that Miss Blackwell's things are taken to the Blue Room." "The Blue Room?" Sebastian's voice carried a note of surprise. "The room next to yours, yes." The Earl's smile was impish despite his obvious frailty. "You are engaged, after all. Propriety allows for some proximity." Honora glanced back at Sebastian and saw her own alarm mirrored in his face. Proximity had not been part of the plan, but there was nothing to be done about it now. The Earl was already guiding her through a grand entrance hall, past portraits of ancestors and suits of armour and centuries of accumulated grandeur, chattering happily about wedding preparations and guest lists, and how delighted the county would be to meet Sebastian's bride. It occurred to Honora, with growing horror, that this deception was going to be considerably more complicated than she had anticipated. The Blue Room was beautiful. That was the first thing Honora noticed when she was finally released from the Earl's enthusiastic company, a large, airy chamber decorated in shades of cornflower and cream, with tall windows overlooking the neglected gardens and a canopied bed that could have slept four. The second thing she noticed was the connecting door to the adjoining room. She stood before it for a long moment, contemplating the impropriety of the arrangement, before a firm knock sounded from the other side. "Miss Blackwell." Sebastian's voice was muffled by the wood. "May I speak with you?" She opened the door to find him standing in what was clearly his own bedroom, looking as discomfited as she felt. "We need to establish boundaries," she said before he could speak. "Agreed. That door remains locked at all times. I will knock if communication is necessary, and you may do the same, but there will be no impropriety." "Yes." Honora studied his face, searching for any sign of ulterior motive, and finding only genuine awkwardness. "Your father seems very pleased." Something cracked in Sebastian's expression. "He has been planning this since the moment I wrote to him about you, the fictional you." He ran a hand through his hair. "I did not expect him to be so happy?" "Alive." The word came out rough, almost broken. "The physicians said he had weeks at best, perhaps days. I thought I would bring you here, introduce you briefly, let him believe his son was settled, and then... He stopped, unable to continue. And then he would pass peacefully, and the deception would end. Yes. Sebastian turned away, moving to the window of his room, his shoulders rigid. Instead, he has rallied. He has plans. The bishop is coming, and there will be dinners and introductions and God knows what else, and I have trapped us both in a lie that was only meant to give a dying man comfort. Honora should have felt resentment at being caught in someone else's desperate scheme. Instead, she found herself moving through the connecting doorway, standing in his room, closer than propriety allowed. "He loves you," she said quietly. "That is why he rallied. He has something to live for now." Sebastian's laugh was bitter. "Yes, a fiction." "Is it?" She was not sure why she pressed the point. "You love him too. That part is real." He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw past the sardonic detachment to the man beneath, exhausted, grieving, desperately trying to navigate an impossible situation with what remained of his pride intact. "My father deserves better than lies. He deserves a real daughter-in-law, real grandchildren, a real future for his name." His voice dropped. "He deserves a son who did not fail him in every way that matters." There was a story there, Honora realized. Pain beyond the obvious. But before she could respond, a servant's voice called from the corridor, announcing that dinner would be served in an hour, and that the Earl requested Miss Blackwell's company in the drawing-room. Sebastian's mask slid back into place so smoothly she might have imagined its absence. "We should dress. My father will expect us to behave as an engaged couple, some shows of affection, nothing excessive. Can you manage that?" "I was raised in respectable society, my lord. I am capable of behaving appropriately." "Sebastian," he said it abruptly, almost unwillingly, "if we are meant to be engaged, you must call me Sebastian." "And I shall call you Honora." She hesitated, then added, "It means honor. My mother chose it." Something flickered in his grey eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of some private irony. "Honora," he repeated slowly, as though testing the sound. "Very well. I shall see you at dinner, Honora." She retreated to her own room and closed the connecting door firmly behind her. An hour later, dressed in the finest of her meagre selections, and with her auburn hair pinned more softly than usual, she descended to the drawing-room and discovered that the situation had become considerably more complicated. "Miss Blackwell." The Earl rose from his chair by the fire with effort, beaming. Come, there is someone you must meet. My brother arrived only an hour ago, quite unannounced. Sebastian. Bring her forward." Sebastian's hand closed around her elbow, his grip tighter than necessary, and Honora understood his tension the moment she saw the man rising from the opposite chair. Bishop Marcus Ashworth was not at all what she had expected. Where the Earl was frail and faded, the bishop was vigorous despite his years, tall and lean like his nephew, with silver hair swept back from a face that bore the marks of sun and wind and long travels. His eyes were dark where Sebastian's were grey, but they held the same piercing intelligence, the same ability to see past surfaces to the truth beneath. He was looking at Honora now with exactly that penetrating gaze. "So," the bishop said, and his voice was deep and measured, carrying the weight of decades spent delivering sermons in distant lands. "This is the woman who has finally captured my nephew's heart. Miss Honora Blackwell, uncle." Sebastian's voice was steady, but Honora felt the tension humming through his body where his arm touched hers. "My betrothed. Miss Blackwell." The bishop crossed to them with the unhurried grace of a man who had learned patience in difficult places. He took Honora's hand, but instead of kissing it or bowing over it, he simply held it, studying her face with disconcerting intensity. "You are not what I expected." "I rarely am, Your Grace." The words escaped before Honora could stop them, and she felt Sebastian's grip tighten in warning. But the bishop merely smiled a slow, thoughtful expression that did not quite reach his eyes. "No, I imagine not. My brother has told me a great deal about you, Miss Blackwell. His letters have been quite enthusiastic. Letters from a father about his son's betrothed are not always reliable," she replied carefully. "Love makes us see what we wish to see." "Indeed it does." The bishop released her hand and stepped back, his gaze moving between her and Sebastian. "I look forward to learning more about you during my visit. I find that the truth of a person reveals itself most clearly over time." There was no mistaking the emphasis on that word. Truth. Honora kept her expression pleasant and her spine straight, but inside, ice was forming around her heart. This man saw too much. This man would not be easily deceived. "I welcome your scrutiny, Your Grace," she said, and was proud that her voice did not waver. "I have nothing to hide." The bishop's smile deepened, and for a moment, Honora thought she saw something almost like approval in his dark eyes. "We shall see, Miss Blackwell. We shall see." Dinner was an exercise in sustained performance. The Earl insisted Honora sit beside him, peppering her with questions about her family, her interests, her hopes for the future. She answered with carefully edited truths. Her father had been a merchant, yes, quite prosperous before his death. Her mother was unwell, unfortunately, which had prevented her from travelling to Derbyshire. She played pianoforte and enjoyed reading, and had always dreamed of a quiet life in the country. The last was not entirely a lie. She had dreamed of such things once, before dreams became luxuries she could not afford. Sebastian sat across from her, playing his part with surprising skill, an occasional touch to her hand when she passed him the salt, a softening of his voice when he spoke to her, a look in his grey eyes that might almost have been tenderness. He was a better actor than she had anticipated, and she found herself wondering how much of his sardonic coldness was genuine and how much was performance of a different kind. The bishop, seated at the foot of the table, said little but observed everything. His dark eyes tracked every interaction, every glance, every hesitation. When Honora reached for her wine-glass at the same moment Sebastian did, and their fingers brushed, she could feel the bishop noting the contact and filing it away for later analysis. By the time the meal ended, and the ladies, such as they were, since Honora was the only one retired to the drawing-room while the gentlemen took port, her nerves were stretched to breaking point. She stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens, and tried to remember why she had agreed to this madness. £50, her mother's treatment, a chance at life instead of slow decay. It had seemed so simple in London. "Miss Blackwell." The bishop's voice came from directly behind her, and she managed not to startle only through sheer force of will. "You seem troubled." "Not troubled, Your Grace. Merely tired from the journey." "Ah." He moved to stand beside her, his gaze following hers to the gardens below. "Ashworth Hall is beautiful, is it not? I grew up here, you know. Sebastian's father and I, running through those gardens, climbing those trees. It was a different time. You must be pleased to see it again." "Pleased?" He repeated the word as though testing its weight. "I am pleased to see my brother before he passes, yes. I am pleased to meet the woman my nephew claims to love." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "But I am troubled as well, Miss Blackwell." Honora's heart stuttered. "Troubled?" "My nephew is not an easy man to know. He keeps himself guarded, reveals little, trusts less. The Sebastian I remember would never have announced an engagement to a woman his family had not met, never have conducted a courtship entirely through letters and brief encounters." The bishop's voice was gentle but relentless. "And yet here you are, installed in the blue room, wearing his mother's pearls." Honora's hand flew to her throat. She had not noticed the pearls when the maid helped her dress, had assumed they were simply part of the wardrobe Sebastian promised to provide. "I see you did not know." The bishop's eyes softened. "Those pearls belonged to Lady Catherine Ashworth, Sebastian's mother. He has kept them locked away since her death. The fact that he gave them to you tells me something, but what it tells me, I am not yet certain." "I don't understand." "Either my nephew truly loves you, Miss Blackwell, in which case I have misjudged him badly, or something far more complicated is happening, in which case—" He paused, and for a moment his mask of placid inquiry slipped, revealing something fierce beneath. "In which case I will discover it. I will not let my brother die with lies on his heart." Before Honora could formulate a response, the door opened and Sebastian entered with the Earl leaning heavily on his arm. The moment passed. The bishop's expression smoothed to pleasant neutrality, and Honora was left clutching her mother's no, Sebastian's mother's pearls, and wondering how she would survive a week under this man's relentless observation. The Earl was flagging visibly now, his earlier energy spent, and Sebastian helped him to his favourite chair with a gentleness that made Honora's chest ache unexpectedly. "Father, you should rest." "Nonsense. The night is young and I have my family around me." The Earl's smile was tremulous but genuine. "Marcus, Miss Blackwell, Honora. I must call you Honora now, Sebastian. Sit, all of you. Let me look at you." They arranged themselves as he directed, Sebastian settling beside Honora on the settee, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of his coat, could smell something clean and masculine beneath the fading scent of port wine. When his hand found hers and clasped it with careful pressure, she knew it was for his father's benefit, but something in her traitorous heart wished it were real. "My brother," the Earl said to the bishop, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You see them? You see how they look at each other?" The bishop's gaze moved between Honora and Sebastian, and whatever he saw made his expression flicker. "I see them, James. That is all I wanted, all I prayed for, these long years since William—" The Earl's voice broke. "I thought Sebastian would never let himself love again. I thought I would die without seeing him happy." "Father," Sebastian's voice was rough. "Please. No, let me say this." The Earl reached out and grasped his son's free hand. "You have given me such joy, bringing her here. Whatever else happens, whatever the future holds, I will die knowing you found someone to love. That is worth more than any title, any estate, any legacy." Honora felt Sebastian's fingers tighten around hers, felt the tremor that ran through him, and understood with sudden clarity that this was not merely an act for him. He loved his father desperately. The deception was not cruelty, but a twisted form of mercy, a final gift to a dying man who wanted nothing more than his son's happiness. And she was part of it now. Not just a hired player, but a participant in something far more complex than a business arrangement. The Earl released Sebastian's hand and sank back in his chair, exhausted. "Marcus, you will stay for the wedding? You will marry them properly, here in the chapel?" "James," the bishop began, promise me you will give them your blessing, make it official, before—" He could not finish, but they all heard the unspoken word, "before I die." The bishop was silent for a long moment. His dark eyes moved from his brother's pleading face to Sebastian's carefully blank expression to Honora's barely concealed distress. Something shifted in his features, decision perhaps, or resignation. "I promise," he said finally. "If they wish to be married here, I will perform the ceremony myself." The Earl's face lit with joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, Marcus. Thank you." Sebastian stood abruptly, pulling Honora up with him. "Father needs rest. I will see you to your chambers." Of course." The Earl waved them off, already half asleep. "Go, children. Tomorrow we will discuss wedding preparations." Honora allowed Sebastian to guide her from the room, but as they passed the bishop, his hand closed briefly around her arm. 3 days, he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "In 3 days, I will know the truth, Miss Blackwell, one way or another." And then she was in the corridor, Sebastian's hand still gripping hers, and the enormity of what she had agreed to crashed over her like a wave. "I heard him," Sebastian said grimly. "He suspects. More than suspects." Honora pulled her hand free, suddenly needing distance. "He as good as told me he intends to expose us. And now he has promised your father—" She could not finish. "I know." Sebastian ran both hands through his hair, destroying whatever order his valet had imposed. "This was meant to be simple. A week of play-acting, a peaceful death, an end to deception. And now we are trapped." Honora heard her own voice as if from a distance, calm and practical despite the panic clawing at her chest. "If the bishop exposes us, your father will die knowing his son lied to him. If we confess willingly, the result is the same. And if we actually marry, we would be bound for life to a stranger." Sebastian's laugh was hollow. "A stranger I hired to play a part. I need the money." The words came out flat, stripped of dignity. "My mother is dying. Without the £50, I cannot pay for her treatment. So whatever we decide, whatever happens, I must see this through." He stared at her, and something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but a kind of recognition. "You are here for your mother. Why else would I agree to such madness? I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "It doesn't matter what I thought. You need the money. I need the deception maintained. The bishop intends to expose us within 3 days. His jaw tightened. "Then we have 3 days to become convincing enough to fool a man who has made a career of distinguishing truth from lies." "That is impossible." "Probably." Sebastian met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something almost like respect in his gaze. "But we are going to try anyway. Tomorrow we begin learning to be in love." Honora thought of her mother, alone in their cramped lodgings, struggling to breathe. She thought of the £50 that would buy medicine and treatment and hope. She thought of the dying Earl's radiant joy and the bishop's penetrating stare and the tangled mess of lies she had wandered into. "Very well," she said. "Tomorrow." She retreated to her room and locked the connecting door and sat on the edge of that enormous bed, staring at the pearls she had unknowingly worn, a dead woman's pearls, given to her by a man who claimed to want nothing but a business arrangement. Nothing about this situation was what she had expected. And as she finally lay down to sleep, Honora Blackwell found herself wondering whether she would survive the week with her heart intact, or whether the deception she had agreed to was already becoming something far more dangerous than pretense. The first lesson in love began at breakfast. Honora descended to find Sebastian already seated at the table, dark circles under his eyes suggesting a night as sleepless as her own. The Earl had not yet risen. Mrs. Bradley, the housekeeper, informed them gently that his lordship was having a difficult morning and would take breakfast in his chambers. But the bishop was present, dressed in clerical black, watching them over the rim of his teacup with those dark, discerning eyes. "Good morning, Miss Blackwell." Sebastian rose as she entered, and before she could react, he crossed to her and pressed a kiss to her cheek. His lips were warm against her skin, the contact brief but deliberate, and she felt heat flood her face despite herself. "Good morning," she managed, and was proud that her voice emerged steady. "I trust you slept well?" He guided her to the chair beside his hand resting briefly at the small of her back. The touches were calculated, she knew designed to present a picture of comfortable intimacy for the bishop's benefit, but her body did not seem to understand the distinction. Her skin tingled where his fingers had pressed. "Tolerably well, thank you." She accepted tea from a footman and focused her attention on the array of dishes before her, selecting toast and eggs with careful deliberation. Anything to avoid meeting the bishop's steady gaze. "I thought we might walk in the gardens this morning," Sebastian said, spreading marmalade on his bread with studied casualness. "The weather is fine, and you mentioned wanting to see the roses." She had mentioned no such thing, but she recognized her cue. "That would be lovely. I have heard so much about your mother's rose garden. Lady Catherine planted it herself the year Sebastian was born." The bishop's voice was mild, conversational, but Honora detected currents beneath the surface. She used to say the roses were her other children. She tended them more carefully than some mothers tend their offspring. Sebastian's hand tightened on his butter knife. "My mother had a gift for growing things." "She did indeed, and for seeing things others missed." The bishop set down his teacup. "I find myself curious, Miss Blackwell, about how you and my nephew came to know one another. The letters from my brother spoke of a musicale, but I confess I find it difficult to imagine Sebastian attending such an event willingly." "I was coerced." Sebastian's tone was dry. "Lady Pemberton threatened to revoke my invitation to her husband's shooting party if I did not attend at least one of her entertainments. I chose the musicale as the least objectionable option. And there you encountered Miss Blackwell. She was playing a Beethoven sonata, badly." Honora's head snapped toward him. "I beg your pardon?" "You were nervous." Sebastian met her eyes, and there was something almost like warmth in his expression. "You rushed the opening passage and fumbled the transition in the second movement, but the third movement—" He paused, as though recalling something genuinely meaningful. "The third movement, you played as though you had forgotten anyone was listening, as though the music had consumed you entirely. I could not look away. It was fiction, of course. The entire story was invention. But something in his voice made it sound real, made her feel as though she had actually sat before a pianoforte in a crowded drawing room and poured her soul into a piece she loved, while a dark-haired stranger watched from the corner. "I did not notice you that evening," she said slowly, playing her part. "I was too mortified by my mistakes. You noticed me later, at the supper interval, when I told you that perfection was boring and passion was infinitely more interesting." The bishop was watching this exchange with undisguised fascination. A remarkably unconventional compliment. "My nephew has never been conventional." Sebastian's father's voice came from the doorway, and they all turned to see the Earl being helped into the room by his valet. He looked worse than he had the previous evening, paler, thinner, his movements slow and careful, but his eyes were bright with pleasure. "Tell them about the letters, Sebastian. Tell them how you wooed her." "Father, you should be resting." "I have rested enough for 3 lifetimes." The Earl allowed himself to be settled into his chair at the head of the table, waving away the footman's offer of food. "Just tea and conversation. That is all the nourishment I need." Sebastian's jaw tightened, but he continued the story with apparent reluctance. "I wrote to her, after the musicale. I could not stop thinking about that third movement, about the woman who had played it with such unguarded emotion. I wanted to know what else she felt so deeply about." "He asked me about everything," Honora added, surprising herself with the ease of the lie. "Books I had read, places I wished to visit, thoughts I had never shared with anyone. His letters were—" She hesitated, searching for the right word, and found herself speaking something unexpectedly true. "They were demanding. He did not want polite pleasantries. He wanted to know who I really was." "And did you tell him?" The bishop leaned forward slightly. "Did you reveal your true self in these letters?" Honora felt the trap in the question. If she claimed to have shared everything, the bishop would test that claim. If she admitted to holding back, he would wonder what she was hiding. "I told him more than I had told anyone since my father's death," she said carefully. "Whether that constitutes my true self, I cannot say. I am not certain anyone can fully know another person through correspondence alone." Wisely spoken. The bishop sat back, his expression thoughtful. "Letters can deceive as easily as they reveal. The written word allows for careful construction, for presenting only what we wish to be seen." "All communication allows for that," Sebastian said sharply. "Speech as easily as writing. The question is not whether deception is possible, but whether it is intended." "And in your case, was deception intended?" The room fell silent. Honora felt the weight of the question pressing against her chest, felt the danger of it like a blade held to her throat. The bishop knew. He must know. This was the moment when everything would unravel. "I intended to make her love me." Sebastian's voice was quiet but steady. "If that required presenting my better qualities while concealing my flaws, then yes, I suppose deception was intended. But I challenge any man in love to claim otherwise." The Earl laughed, a thin sound that dissolved into coughing. When he recovered, he reached across the table to grip his son's hand. "That is the most honest thing I have heard you say in years, my boy. Love makes liars of us all. We cannot help it. We so desperately want to be worthy of the one we love." The bishop's expression shifted, something complicated moving through his features, before settling into something almost like resignation. "Very well. I will concede the point for now. But I shall be watching, nephew. Love that is genuine only grows stronger under scrutiny. If what you share with Miss Blackwell is real, you have nothing to fear from my observation." It was not an absolution, Honora realized. It was a warning. But it was also a reprieve. The walk in the gardens became the first of many staged intimacies that day. Sebastian led her through his mother's roses still blooming, despite the lateness of the season, and spoke of his childhood with an openness that surprised her. Some of it was clearly invention, designed for any watching servants to report back to the household. But other details felt genuine. The tree he had fallen from at age 7, breaking his arm. The pond where he and his brother had caught frogs. The bench where his mother used to sit and read aloud while her sons played at her feet. "Your brother," Honora said quietly, as they paused before a particularly magnificent climber, its blossoms a deep and velvety red. "Your father mentioned him last night." "William?" Sebastian's expression shuttered. "Yes. You do not have to tell me. But if the bishop asks, the bishop knows exactly what happened to William. He presided at the funeral." Sebastian reached out and touched one of the roses, his fingers gentle on the delicate petals. "My brother fell in love with a woman our father considered unsuitable. The daughter of a merchant, ironic, given our present circumstances. Father forbade the match. William challenged her other suitor to a duel and died for it. I am sorry. Everyone was sorry. It changed nothing." He pulled his hand back and began walking again, his stride longer now, forcing her to hurry to keep pace. "William was everything I was not: charming, warm, open-hearted. He believed in love the way the devout believe in God, and it killed him. You blame love itself, not the duel, not your father's interference, not the other man's aim. I blame the madness that made him think dying was preferable to living without her." Sebastian stopped abruptly, turning to face her. He had everything: title, fortune, family, future. He threw it all away for a woman he had known 6 months. That is not love, it is insanity. Honora held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated by the pain blazing in his eyes. "And so you swore never to let yourself feel that way, never to love anyone enough to be destroyed by it." "I swore to be rational, to make decisions based on logic rather than passion, to never give another person enough power over me to make me a fool." His laugh was bitter. "And yet here I am, lying to my dying father, entangled in a deception that grows more complicated by the hour, with a woman I hired to play the part of my beloved. Not so different from William, after all." The words escaped before she could consider their wisdom, and she watched them strike him like a physical blow. For a moment, she thought he might walk away, might leave her standing among the roses while he retreated into his anger. But instead, something in his expression cracked, revealing exhaustion and grief, and a loneliness that matched her own. "No," he said quietly. "Perhaps not." They stood there in silence while the autumn wind stirred the rose petals, and somewhere in the distance a bird called mournfully. Honora wanted to offer comfort, but did not know how. She wanted to retreat to the safety of their business arrangement, but found she could not. "We should return," Sebastian said finally. "My father will wonder where we are." They walked back to the house side by side, not touching, not speaking, but something had shifted between them nonetheless. Some wall had cracked, some barrier had lowered, and Honora found herself wondering whether the danger she faced was not the bishop's scrutiny after all, but something far more treacherous, the growing suspicion that the man beside her was not merely a means to £50, but a person she might actually come to understand. The afternoon brought a new challenge: the arrival of Sebastian's cousin, Mr. Harold Ashworth. Harold was a fleshy man in his middle 40s, with small eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He presented himself as concerned family, travelling all the way from London upon hearing of the Earl's decline, but Honora recognized immediately what he truly was: a circling vulture, waiting for death to grant him what life had denied. "The estate," Sebastian murmured to her, as they watched Harold greet the Earl with effusive false sympathy. "If I die without heirs, Harold inherits everything. He has been waiting for that outcome since William's death. And if you marry, then any children of mine displace him in the succession. He has considerable motivation to ensure this engagement fails." Harold's gaze slid to Honora across the room, assessing and cold despite his smile. "Miss Blackwell, is it? I don't believe I know the name. Your family is from Hampshire, originally." The lie came easily. She had prepared for this question. "Though we have lived in London these past many years." "Hampshire, how charming." Harold's tone suggested it was anything but. "And your father's profession?" "He was a merchant, quite successful before his death." Something flickered in Harold's expression. Triumph, perhaps, or anticipation. A merchant. How interesting. "Sebastian, I had no idea your tastes ran to trade." "My tastes run to intelligence and strength of character." Sebastian's voice was ice. "Both qualities in short supply among the daughters of the nobility I have encountered. Still, one must consider appearances. The Ashworth name carries certain expectations. The Ashworth name will be carried by my children, not by the reputation of their maternal grandfather." Sebastian rose from his chair, and Honora saw the dangerous tension in his posture. "If you have concerns about my choice of bride, Harold, I suggest you keep them to yourself. You are here as a guest, not an advisor." Harold's smile tightened. "Of course, cousin. I meant no offence. I merely thought Miss Blackwell should understand the challenges she faces in entering our family." "The challenges I face," Honora said, surprised by the steel in her own voice, "are of no concern to those outside this house. My understanding with Lord Ashworth is between the two of us, and we are quite content with it." The room went silent. She felt the bishop's gaze on her, felt the Earl's delighted attention, felt Sebastian's surprise radiating from his position beside her. She had overstepped. She was meant to be quiet and agreeable. A convenient fiction, but something about Harold's sneering condescension had awakened the part of her that had once argued politics with her father's business partners and held her own in rooms full of men who expected women to simper and defer. "Well said." The Earl's voice broke the tension, warm with approval. "Sebastian, you have found yourself a woman of spine. That is worth more than any pedigree." "I quite agree, father." Sebastian's hand found hers and clasped it firmly. "Miss Blackwell has already demonstrated more character than many ladies of my acquaintance. I am fortunate she agreed to have me." Harold's expression soured, but he had enough sense to retreat into silence. The conversation turned to safer topics: the weather, the upcoming harvest, news from London, and gradually the tension eased. But Honora remained aware of Harold's watching eyes throughout the afternoon, cataloguing her every word and gesture, searching for weaknesses to exploit. He would be a problem. She would need to be careful. That evening, the Earl insisted on music. "Miss Blackwell plays beautifully," he told the assembled company: Harold, the bishop, Mrs. Bradley, who had been invited to join them as a courtesy, and Sebastian, whose expression suggested he would rather be anywhere else. "Sebastian has spoken of it often. Please, my dear, indulge an old man." Honora approached the pianoforte, a magnificent instrument that had clearly been lovingly maintained despite the household's financial struggles, and seated herself on the bench with a sense of unreality. She had not played for pleasure in years. Her teaching focused on drilling scales and correcting students' mistakes, not on performance. But she had once loved music, had played for hours when her family could still afford a pianoforte of their own, losing herself in the patterns and progressions until the world fell away. She chose the Beethoven sonata Sebastian had described that morning, the one she had supposedly played at a musicale they had never attended. It seemed fitting somehow. A fiction made real through performance. Her fingers found the opening passage, and she forced herself to slow down, to resist the nervousness that made her rush. The notes rang clear in the drawing room, and she heard the Earl sigh with pleasure. She moved through the second movement with careful attention, avoiding the fumble Sebastian had invented, and then the third movement began, and she forgot to be careful. It was a piece she had played countless times as a girl, when her father still lived, and her family still had money, and the future still seemed bright with possibility. The melody was fire and grief and longing, written by a man going deaf who could only hear music in his memory, and she had always felt as though she were channeling something larger than herself when she played it. Her fingers flew across the keys. The music swelled and crashed and soared, and somewhere in the midst of it, she became aware that she was crying silent tears sliding down her cheeks as the emotions she had suppressed for 3 long years broke free at last. The final notes faded into silence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the Earl began to applaud, and the bishop joined him, and even Harold managed grudging acknowledgement. But Honora was looking at Sebastian, who had not moved, who was staring at her with an expression she could not decipher: wonder, perhaps, or recognition, or something even more complicated. "That," the Earl said softly, "is why my son loves you." Honora wiped her eyes with trembling fingers and tried to smile. "Forgive me. I do not usually become so emotional." "Never apologize for feeling deeply." The Earl's voice was fierce despite its weakness. "That is what makes life worth living. Sebastian, help Miss Blackwell to some brandy. She has earned it." Sebastian moved to comply, pressing a glass into her hands with fingers that brushed hers longer than necessary. "You were right," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. The third movement. "You invented that story," she whispered back. "You could not possibly have known." "I knew." His grey eyes held hers, and something passed between them that she could not name. Sometimes we recognize truth even before we encounter it. She did not know what to say to that. She drank the brandy instead, letting its warmth spread through her chest, and wondered when performance had begun to blur into reality. The following days took on a rhythm that felt increasingly natural despite its foundation in deception. Mornings brought walks in the gardens, where Sebastian shared stories of his childhood, and Honora found herself reciprocating with tales of her own careful versions, edited for propriety, but real nonetheless. The happy years before her father's gambling destroyed everything. The mother who had once been vivacious, and now barely left her bed. The sister who had married young and moved to Scotland, too wrapped up in her own happiness to notice her family's decline. "You are angry with her," Sebastian observed on the third morning, as they walked along the lake's edge. "Your sister. I am practical about her. She saw an opportunity for escape and took it. I cannot blame her for that. But you did not take the same opportunity. You stayed. Someone had to care for our mother." Honora heard the defensiveness in her voice and tried to soften it. "Charlotte is not unkind. She sends money when she can. But she has her own children now, her own concerns. And no room for a spinster sister and an invalid mother. I am hardly a spinster. You are 26 and unmarried. By society's standards, you are firmly on the shelf." His tone was dry but not cruel. "Though I confess I find society's standards on this matter to be nonsensical. What man would not want a wife with intelligence and capability rather than a decorative empty head of 18? Most men, in my experience. Then most men are fools." He stopped walking, turning to face her with an expression she could not quite read. "You deserve better than you have received, Miss Blackwell. Whatever happens when this week ends, I want you to know that." She felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cool autumn air. "That is unexpectedly kind." "I am capable of kindness on occasion. Pray do not spread it about my reputation would never recover." She laughed despite herself, and saw answering warmth kindle in his eyes. This was dangerous, she knew. She was beginning to like him, beginning to look forward to their conversations, to the sharp wit that masked a surprisingly thoughtful mind, to the glimpses of vulnerability he showed when he thought she was not watching. She could not afford to like him. He was a means to an end, £50 and nothing more. But as they resumed their walk, his arm brushing hers with easy familiarity, she found the reminder increasingly difficult to believe. The bishop requested her assistance that afternoon. "I require someone to help with correspondence," he explained, leading her to a small study off the main library. "My handwriting has grown uncertain with age, and there are several letters I must send before I depart. Sebastian mentioned you have a steady hand." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it. The bishop wanted her alone, away from Sebastian's protective presence, where he could probe and question without interference. Honora sat at the desk he indicated and prepared pen and paper with steady movements. "I am happy to help, Your Grace." "I'm certain you are." He lowered himself into a chair across from her, making no move to dictate any letters. "Tell me, Miss Blackwell, how did you truly come to be engaged to my nephew?" She had prepared for this question. The story was ready on her lips, polished through days of rehearsal. But something in the bishop's gaze made her hesitate, a kindness beneath the scrutiny, a genuine desire to understand rather than merely to expose. "We met as Sebastian described," she said carefully, "at a musicale." "Which musicale? When?" "Lady Pemberton's in July." "Curious. Lady Pemberton's musicales are typically held in January and April. I attended several before my travels began." Honora felt the ground shift beneath her. "Perhaps I am mistaken about the month." "Perhaps." The bishop leaned forward. "Or perhaps the event never happened at all. Perhaps this entire engagement is a construction designed to give a dying man false comfort." She opened her mouth to deny it, to reinforce the fiction, but the words would not come. The bishop's dark eyes held hers, and in them she saw not accusation, but something almost like compassion. "You are not a cruel woman, Miss Blackwell. That much is evident. Whatever brought you to this house, whatever bargain you struck with my nephew, cruelty is not your nature." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "But neither are you a fool. You must know that deception of this magnitude cannot be sustained indefinitely." "I know only that your brother is dying," she said quietly, "and that Sebastian could not bear to break his heart." "By telling him the truth. By telling him there would be no marriage, no grandchildren, no continuation of the family line." She met the bishop's gaze directly. "Sebastian has sworn never to marry. He made that decision when William died, and nothing has shaken it in 10 years. When his father begged for news of a betrothal, Sebastian invented one rather than watch him grieve anew. And you? Where do you fit into this compassionate fiction?" "I needed money." The words came out flat, stripped of any attempt at dignity. "My mother is dying as well, Your Grace. She requires treatment I cannot afford." "Sebastian offered £50 for 1 week of my time, enough to save her life, or at least to prolong it." The bishop was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had yet heard it. "So you are both motivated by love. He by love for his father, you by love for your mother. We are motivated by desperation. Love may be the root of it, but desperation is what drives us now. And if I expose this deception, if I tell my brother the truth—" Honora felt cold dread settle in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady. "Then he will die knowing his son lied to him, and I will return to London with nothing, and my mother will die as well. You will have told the truth, Your Grace. Whether that truth brings more harm or good, only God can judge." She watched the bishop absorb her words, watched the struggle play out across his weathered features. He was a man of faith, she realized, not merely of profession, someone who truly believed in the principles he preached, who genuinely grappled with questions of right and wrong. "You are asking me to become complicit in a lie," he said finally. "I am asking nothing. I am merely explaining the consequences of truth. You are cleverer than you appear, Miss Blackwell." There was respect in his voice now, grudging but real. "And perhaps kinder as well. The music you played last night that was not a performance for my benefit, that was genuine feeling. Music has always been my solace. I did not expect to weep over a Beethoven sonata, but I have not played for pleasure in 3 years. The emotions escaped me, as they escape Sebastian when he looks at you." The bishop rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the grey afternoon. "I have been watching him these past days. At first, I looked for evidence of deception, for proof that his feelings were manufactured, but I have seen something else instead." "What have you seen?" "A man learning to feel again." The bishop turned back to face her. "Sebastian has been closed off for 10 years, remote, sardonic, unwilling to let anyone past his defences. His father despaired of him. I despaired of him. We thought William's death had killed something in him that could never be restored. And now I see him touch your hand and forget to check if anyone is watching. I see him laugh at your wit and mean it. I see him look at you when you are not looking at him, with an expression that cannot be feigned." The bishop's voice grew heavy with significance. "Whatever this arrangement began as, Miss Blackwell, it is becoming something else. The question is whether you are willing to let it." Honora felt her heart stutter in her chest. "I don't understand what you mean." "I think you do." He crossed to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "I will not expose you to my brother. Whatever truth there is to be told, I leave it to Sebastian's conscience and to yours. but I suggest you consider carefully what you want from this situation before circumstances remove the choice from your hands." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone with the unsent letters and the deafening silence of her own thoughts. That evening, the Earl announced that the wedding would take place in 3 days. "The chapel has been cleaned, the flowers ordered, the license obtained." His voice was stronger than it had been in days, animated by purpose and joy. "Marcus has agreed to perform the ceremony himself. I know it is sudden, my dear," this to Honora, whose expression must have betrayed her shock, "but I fear I have not much time left. I want to see my son married before I go." "Father," Sebastian began. "No arguments." The Earl raised a trembling hand. "I have asked for so little from you these past years. This one thing, let me have this one thing." Honora watched Sebastian's face as he struggled between horror and love, between the impossible situation and the father who wanted only his happiness. She saw the moment when he surrendered, when he realized there was no way to refuse without breaking the old man's heart. "Of course, father," he said quietly, "if Honora is willing." All eyes turned to her, the Earl, hopeful and fading, the bishop, watching with that knowing gaze, Harold, barely concealing his fury at this development, and Sebastian, whose grey eyes held a question he could not speak aloud, a plea for her to follow him into this deepening deception, whatever the cost. "I am willing," she heard herself say. The Earl wept with joy. Sebastian gripped her hand with bruising force. Harold excused himself with barely controlled rage, and the bishop watched it all with an expression of profound uncertainty. That night, Honora paced her room until the candles burned low, trying to understand what she had agreed to. A real marriage, a binding legal contract. All for a dying man's comfort and a £50 payment that suddenly seemed insignificant against the weight of what she had promised. A knock came at the connecting door. She opened it to find Sebastian standing in his shirt sleeves, his cravat discarded, his hair dishevelled from running his hands through it repeatedly. "We need to talk." "Yes." She stepped back to let him enter, propriety forgotten in the face of crisis. "I assume you have a plan." "I have the beginning of one." He paced to the window and back, his agitation visible in every line of his body. "We marry in 3 days. We remain married until my father passes a fortnight at most, according to the physicians. Then we return to London and seek an annulment on grounds of non-consummation. Will that work?" "It should." "The marriage will be unconsummated. I give you my word on that, and an annulment can be obtained quietly, without scandal, if both parties agree." He stopped pacing and turned to face her. "You will receive your £50, plus an additional 50 for the extended deception. I will see to it that you are not disadvantaged by this arrangement." £100. More money than she had seen in years, enough to secure her mother's treatment and their lodgings for months to come. It was everything she needed, and yet she found herself hesitating. "Your father's solicitor," she said slowly. "Mr. Whitmore. I heard you speaking with him yesterday in the study." Sebastian went still. "You heard that?" "I was in the library. Your voice is carried." She met his eyes directly. "You told him you would pay me double to go through with a real ceremony. You were making arrangements before you had even asked me. I was preparing for contingencies. You were assuming I would agree, because I am poor and desperate and easily purchased." The anger that had been simmering since yesterday finally broke free. "Is that all I am to you? A transaction to be managed?" "No." The word came out sharp, almost fierce. "That is not Honora. You must understand." "I understand perfectly." She moved away from him, putting the width of the room between them. "You needed a convenient fiction, and I fit the requirements. Presentable enough to fool your family, poor enough to be bought, practical enough to see it through. I am a solution to a problem, nothing more." "That is not true." Sebastian followed her, closing the distance she had created. "Yes, I sought someone who could play a part. Yes, money was the incentive. But these past days watching you with my father, hearing you play, seeing the way you refused to be cowed by Harold or anyone else." He stopped, struggling for words. "You have become more than a transaction. You have become—" "What?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What have I become?" He was close now, close enough that she could see the individual flecks of darker grey in his eyes, close enough that his breath warmed her skin. "Someone I do not want to lose." She should step back, should remind him of boundaries and propriety and the business nature of their arrangement, should protect herself from the danger she had felt building since the first day in the rose garden. Instead, she stayed where she was. "Sebastian." He kissed her. It was not gentle. It was not careful. It was the kiss of a man who had spent 10 years denying himself the right to feel, finally breaking under the weight of his own restraint. His hands came up to cup her face, his fingers threading through her hair as her careful pins scattered, and she kissed him back with an urgency that matched his own. For one perfect, terrifying moment, everything else fell away. The deception, the money, the dying Earl, the watching Bishop, all the complications that had brought them to this point. There was only his mouth on hers, and her hands fisting in his shirt, and the heat that blazed between them like wildfire. Then he pulled back, breathing hard, his forehead pressed against hers. "I should not have done that." "No." Her voice was unsteady. "You should not have. I am still paying you. This is still an arrangement. Whatever I feel, whatever is happening between us, it does not change the fundamental inequality of our situation." "No." She forced herself to step back, to put distance between them. "It does not." He watched her, his expression raw with emotions he usually kept hidden. "Honora, we should sleep." She moved to the connecting door and held it open, a clear dismissal. "We both need rest, and we need to think clearly about what happens next." He went, pausing at the threshold to look back at her. "I meant what I said. You have become more than a transaction." "Perhaps." She could not quite meet his eyes. "But you are still paying me, and I am still poor. And whatever this is, it cannot be trusted until those facts change." She closed the door between them and leaned against it, her heart pounding, her lips still tingling from his kiss. What had she done? What were they becoming? And how could she protect herself from an attachment that was growing beyond her control? Morning brought a measure of composure, but the memory of the kiss hung between them like smoke, invisible but impossible to ignore. They played their parts at breakfast with careful precision, touching when required, speaking with appropriate warmth, but there was a new tension beneath the performance that Honora felt certain the Bishop could see. To his credit, he said nothing. Perhaps he had decided to let events unfold as they would. Perhaps he was simply waiting for the inevitable collapse. The wedding preparations consumed the day. Honora was measured for a gown, a simple but elegant ivory silk that made her feel like a stranger in her own reflection. The chapel was inspected and approved, the flowers arranged, the guest list finalized. A small gathering, the Earl insisted family only, with a few close neighbors to serve as witnesses. Still, Honora counted nearly 30 names on the list and felt panic flutter in her chest. 30 people would witness her marry Sebastian Ashworth. 30 people would believe it real. And in 3 days, it would be. Harold made his move that afternoon. Honora was crossing the entrance hall when she found him waiting, his smile pleasant and his eyes cold. "Miss Blackwell? A word, if I may." She wanted to refuse, but recognized the futility. "Of course, Mr. Ashworth." He led her to a small parlour off the main corridor and closed the door behind them, an impropriety that set her nerves on edge. "I have been making inquiries," he said without preamble. "About you. About your family." "Indeed." "Your father was Samuel Blackwell, a merchant who lost his fortune to gambling debts and left his family in poverty. Your mother is an invalid. Your sister fled to Scotland with a minor baronet. And you—" he stepped closer. "You have been living in near destitution for 3 years, taking in mending and teaching music to tradesmen's daughters to survive." Honora kept her expression neutral, despite the chill spreading through her chest. "You have been thorough." "I protect my interests." Harold's smile widened. "You are not an appropriate bride for a future earl. The scandal, when it emerges, and it will emerge, Miss Blackwell, I shall see to that will destroy Sebastian's position in society and taint the Ashworth name for generations. Unless you leave, tonight, before the wedding can take place." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a leather purse, which he placed on the table between them. £200, more than enough to cover your mother's treatment and establish yourself respectably somewhere far from London. In exchange, you disappear and never contact this family again. £200, 4 times what Sebastian had promised, more money than she had ever held in her hands, and all she had to do was abandon the man she was beginning to love. She looked at the purse, feeling its weight as a physical temptation. It would solve everything. Her mother would be saved, their future secured, and she would be free of this impossible tangle of lies and feelings. But she would also be free of Sebastian, of the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, of the dry wit that made her laugh despite herself, of the vulnerability he showed to no one else, and the kiss that still burned on her lips. No. The word emerged before she had consciously decided, and she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. "I beg your pardon?" "No, Mr. Ashworth." She met his eyes directly. "I will not be bought. Not by you, not by anyone. Whatever happens between Sebastian and me, whatever the truth of this engagement, it is not your concern. And if you attempt to interfere again, I will tell him exactly what you have offered, and he will deal with you accordingly." Harold's face darkened with fury. "You are making a mistake, Miss Blackwell. I have resources you cannot imagine. I will expose you, then expose me." She moved to the door and opened it, standing aside in clear dismissal. "But know that if you destroy Sebastian's happiness to serve your own ambition, you will make an enemy not only of him, but of the bishop as well. And I suspect the Earl's final wishes carry considerable weight in this family." For a long moment, Harold stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. Then he snatched up the purse and pushed past her into the corridor, his footsteps angry on the marble floor. Honora waited until he was gone before allowing herself to lean against the door frame, her legs trembling beneath her. She had refused £200. She had chosen Sebastian over security, over certainty, over everything practical and sensible. What had she done? That night, she told Sebastian everything. They stood in the garden, beneath the stars, far enough from the house that they could not be overheard. The air was cold, autumn deepening toward winter, and their breath misted between them as she recounted Harold's offer and her refusal. Sebastian listened in silence. When she finished, his expression was unreadable in the darkness. £200, he said finally. "You turned down £200? "Yes." "Why?" She had asked herself the same question a dozen times since that afternoon. The answers she had found were complicated, tangled, impossible to articulate. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said finally. "And because—" She took a breath. "Because I am no longer certain I want to leave." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Then Sebastian moved, closing the distance between them, his hands finding hers in the darkness. "Honora," his voice was rough. "What are you saying?" "I don't know." The admission came out broken, confused. "I came here for money. I agreed to a deception. Everything was supposed to be simple, a business arrangement, nothing more. But then I met your father, and I saw how much he loves you, and I began to understand why you would lie to protect him. And then I met you, and I discovered that you were not what I expected, that beneath the sardonic coldness was someone who felt things deeply, who was afraid of feeling, who had closed himself off to avoid the pain your brother's death caused. Honora, I am not finished." She gripped his hands tighter. "I do not know if what I feel is real or simply a product of the performance. I do not know if you feel anything for me beyond gratitude for playing my part well, but I know that when Harold offered me money to leave, I could not take it, because leaving would have meant never seeing you again, and that—" her voice cracked. "That was a price I was not willing to pay." Sebastian was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I have spent 10 years convincing myself that love was weakness, that caring for anyone too deeply was an invitation to destruction. William's death proved that, or so I believed. And so I built walls. I made myself untouchable. I decided that if I never let anyone in, I could never be hurt, as my brother was hurt. And now? Now I find that I have let you in despite myself." His hands came up to cup her face, tilting it toward his. "I do not know when it happened. Perhaps when I watched you weep over Beethoven. Perhaps when I saw you stand up to Harold at dinner. Perhaps when you told me about your mother, and I understood that you were as desperate as I was, and as brave, and as willing to do whatever was necessary for the people you loved. Sebastian, I am falling in love with you." The words emerged like a confession, torn from somewhere deep inside him. "God help me, but I am, and I do not know what to do about it, because you are still poor, and I am still paying you, and nothing about this situation is what it should be." She reached up and covered his hands with her own. "Then perhaps we should change the situation." "How?" "Marry me." The words came out before she could second-guess them. "Not for your father, not for the deception, not for money. Marry me because you want to. Because I want to. Because whatever this is between us, it deserves a chance to become something real." He stared at her in the darkness, and she felt the tremor that ran through him. "You would do that? Bind yourself to a man you have known less than a week? Your brother knew the woman he loved for 6 months before he was willing to die for her." She smiled despite herself. "I am not suggesting we duel anyone. I am merely suggesting we take a chance on each other, on the possibility that what we feel is genuine. And the money? Your mother's treatment? I will accept it as a wedding gift from my husband, freely given, not payment for services rendered." She lifted her chin. "If you are willing to give it under those terms." Sebastian laughed, a sound of pure surprise, and something that might have been joy. "You are negotiating the terms of our marriage while proposing to me in a garden. I am a merchant's daughter. It is in my blood." "So it would seem." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her as though he feared she might vanish. "Very well, Miss Blackwell. Honora, I accept your proposal. I will marry you in 2 days, not for my father, not for any audience, but because I have discovered that life without you seems impossibly bleak. That is not very romantic. I am not a romantic man." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the corner of her mouth. "But I am learning. You will have to be patient with me." "I am not known for patience." "Then we are well matched indeed." He kissed her properly then, And this time there was no guilt in it, no confusion, only the beginning of something new and fragile and terrifyingly real. When they finally drew apart, Honora found that she was crying again. "What is it?" Sebastian's voice was concerned. "Have I done something wrong?" "No." She wiped her eyes and laughed at herself. "I am simply not accustomed to hope. It is taking some adjustment." He pulled her close and held her as the stars wheeled overhead and the cold autumn wind stirred the dying roses. "Adjust slowly," he said against her hair. "We have time." But even as he spoke, neither of them heard the soft footfall on the gravel path or saw the shadow that slipped away into the darkness. Harold Ashworth, his face twisted with fury, already planning his revenge. The morning of the wedding dawned grey and cold, with frost silvering the windows and a bitter wind rattling the shutters of Ashworth Hall. Honora woke before dawn, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and terror that made sleep impossible. Today she would marry Sebastian Ashworth, not for money, not for deception, but because somewhere in the chaos of the past week she had fallen in love with him. The realization still felt fragile, easily shattered by too much examination. She had known him less than 7 days. She had come to his house as a hired player in a fiction. Everything about their situation defied logic and propriety and common sense. And yet, when she thought of returning to London without him, of resuming her life of mending and music lessons and slow decay, something in her chest contracted with pain she could not dismiss. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the future they had barely begun to imagine together. Mrs. Bradley arrived with breakfast on a tray and a young maid to help with dressing. The ivory silk gown had been pressed to perfection, and the veil, a delicate thing of Brussels lace that had belonged to Sebastian's mother, lay waiting on the bed like a ghost made tangible. "His lordship chose it himself," Mrs. Bradley said, noting Honora's expression as she touched the lace. "Lady Catherine wore it at her own wedding, 40 years past. Lord Thornfield said you should have something of the family, to mark you as one of us." Honora felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back. She would not begin her wedding day weeping, no matter how touched she was by Sebastian's gesture. "Please thank him for me," she managed. "It is beautiful." The hours that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Her hair was dressed with small white flowers from the greenhouse, her mother's pearls, Catherine's pearls, clasped around her throat. The gown fit perfectly, transforming her from a poor merchant's daughter into something that might pass for a viscountess. When she finally stood before the mirror, fully arrayed, she barely recognized herself. "You look lovely, miss." The young maid's voice was soft with admiration. "Lord Thornfield is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Honora said, and meant it. A knock came at the door, and Mrs. Bradley opened it to reveal the bishop, dressed in his ceremonial vestments, his expression grave but not unkind. "Miss Blackwell, a word before the ceremony?" She nodded and followed him into the corridor, her silk skirts whispering against the floor. He led her to a window alcove overlooking the frost-covered gardens, far enough from servants' ears to speak privately. "I have watched you these past days," he said without preamble. "I came here intending to expose a deception, to protect my brother from lies in his final weeks. Instead, I have witnessed something I did not expect." "What have you witnessed?" "Transformation." The bishop's dark eyes held hers. "When you arrived, you were a woman playing a part competent, careful, guarded. But something changed. The walls came down. The performance became genuine." He paused. "I saw you in the garden last night, with Sebastian." Honora felt heat flood her cheeks. "You were watching?" "I was taking my evening constitutional, and came upon you by accident. I did not intend to eavesdrop, but—" A faint smile crossed his weathered features. "I confess I was curious, and what I heard convinced me that whatever this arrangement began as, it has become something real. I love him." The words came out simply, without embellishment. "I did not intend to. I did not want to. But I do. I know." The bishop reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and surprisingly gentle. "And he loves you. I have known Sebastian since the day he was born, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not even before William's death. Then you will perform the ceremony? Truly?" "I will perform it with joy." His voice grew solemn. "But I must ask you one thing first, Miss Blackwell. One question that requires an honest answer. Ask. If the money were not a factor, if Sebastian had nothing to offer you but himself, would you still marry him today?" Honora thought of her mother, lying ill in London. Thought of the £50, no, £100 that would secure her treatment. Thought of everything practical and sensible that should weigh in her decision. Then she thought of Sebastian's grey eyes, and his rare smile, and the way he kissed her, as though she were precious beyond measure. "Yes," she said, "I would marry him if he were a pauper. I would marry him if he had nothing but debts. I would marry him because—" Her voice caught. "Because when I imagine my life without him, it feels like a sentence rather than a future." The bishop's smile widened, transforming his stern features into something almost warm. "Then let us go and make you a wife." The chapel at Ashworth Hall was small but beautiful, its ancient stones softened by centuries of prayer and the gentle light filtering through stained glass windows. Candles blazed against the grey morning, and hothouse flowers filled the air with sweetness. The Earl had been carried down on a litter, installed in a bath chair at the front of the chapel, where he could witness every moment of his son's wedding. His face was grey with exhaustion, but luminous with joy, and when Honora entered on the arm of a footman, for she had no father to give her away, she saw tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. Sebastian stood at the altar, dressed in dark blue superfine, his cravat immaculate for once, his hair combed into submission. But his eyes, those winter-grey eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. As she walked toward him down the narrow aisle, past the watching neighbours and the resentful Harold and the weeping servants, she saw something in his expression that erased the last of her doubts. He loved her. Whatever improbable circumstances had brought them together, whatever deceptions had paved the way, he loved her now, and she loved him. The ceremony began with the bishop's resonant voice filling the small space. Honora heard the words distantly, her attention consumed by Sebastian's hand gripping hers, by the warmth of him beside her, by the magnitude of what they were doing. "Do you, Sebastian Henry Ashworth, Viscount Thornfield, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was steady, but his fingers tightened on hers. "And do you, Honora Eleanor Blackwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." The words emerged clear and strong, surprising even herself. The bishop smiled. "Then by the power vested in me, stop." The voice came from the back of the chapel, and Honora felt her heart stutter as she turned to see Harold Ashworth pushing his way through the assembled guests. "I must object to this union." Harold's voice was loud, carrying to every corner of the small space. "This woman is not who she claims to be. She is a fortune hunter, a hired impostor brought here to deceive a dying man. I have proof." Gasps rippled through the congregation. The Earl made a small, wounded sound. Sebastian's grip on Honora's hand became almost painful. "What proof?" The bishop's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Witness statements from the employment agency, where Lord Thornfield placed an advertisement seeking a— Harold consulted a paper in his hand. Temporary companion of respectable bearing. I have the original notice in his own solicitor's hand. I have sworn testimony from the agent who placed Miss Blackwell in this position. This marriage is a fraud. The chapel erupted in murmurs. Honora felt the weight of every eye upon her, felt the fragile hope she had built crumbling around her. She should have known it could not last, should have known that happiness was not meant for women like her. "Father," Sebastian began, turning toward the Earl. "Let me speak." Honora's voice cut through the chaos, surprising even herself. She released Sebastian's hand and stepped forward, facing Harold and the assembled guests with her chin raised. "Mr. Ashworth speaks the truth." A collective gasp. "I was hired to play a part. Lord Thornfield needed a fiancée to present to his dying father, and I needed money to pay for my mother's medical treatment. It was a business arrangement, nothing more." "Honora," Sebastian's voice was anguished. "Let me finish." She drew a breath, steadying herself. "I came to this house expecting to perform a role for 1 week and return to my life unchanged. What I found instead was—" Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. "Was a family, a dying man who welcomed me as a daughter, a household that treated me with kindness I had not known in years, and a man who, despite every intention to remain cold and guarded, showed me what it might mean to be truly loved." She turned to face the Earl, whose expression was unreadable behind his tears. "My lord, I deceived you, and for that I am truly sorry. But the love I feel for your son is not a deception. It grew despite my intentions, despite all logic, despite everything that should have prevented it. I love Sebastian. I love him not for his title or his fortune, but for the man he is beneath, the man who reads poetry in secret and visits his father every night and is terrified of feeling anything because feeling once destroyed his brother." The chapel was utterly silent. "If you cannot forgive the lie," Honora continued, her voice dropping to something just above a whisper, "I will understand. I will leave this house and trouble you no further. But know that every moment of affection I showed you these past days was genuine. You have been more of a father to me than my own ever was, and I will carry that with me, whatever happens now." For a long moment no one moved. Then slowly the Earl raised a trembling hand. "Come here, child." Honora crossed to his bath chair and knelt beside it, heedless of her silk gown on the cold stone floor. The Earl reached out and cupped her face in his frail hands, his watery eyes searching hers. "You say my son loves you?" "I believe he does, my lord." "And you love him? Truly? Not for money or position or any practical consideration?" "I would love him if he were a stable hand." The words came out fierce, unguarded. "I would love him if he had nothing to offer but himself." The Earl smiled a slow, radiant expression that transformed his wasted features. "Then that is all that matters." He turned to the bishop. "Marcus, continue the ceremony." "But," Harold sputtered, "the deception, the fraud, was born of love." The Earl's voice gained strength. "My son lied to spare me pain. This woman agreed to help him for money she desperately needed. Both of them made choices I cannot entirely approve, but I understand them, and what has grown between them is real." He looked at Sebastian, who had not moved from his place at the altar. "Is it real, my boy?" Sebastian's jaw was tight with emotion, but his voice was steady. "It is real, father. I love her. I did not plan to. I tried not to. But I do." "Then marry her." The Earl sank back in his chair, exhausted but triumphant. "Marry her now, before I lose what strength remains." Harold made one more attempt to protest, but the bishop silenced him with a look that could have frozen hellfire. "Mr. Ashworth, you have made your objections known. They have been considered and dismissed. If you wish to remain for the remainder of the ceremony, you will do so in silence. If not, you may leave." Harold's face contorted with fury, but he had enough sense to recognize defeat. He turned and stalked out of the chapel, slamming the door behind him with a force that echoed through the ancient stones. The bishop turned back to Sebastian and Honora, his expression softening. "Where were we?" The wedding feast was modest by aristocratic standards, but perfect in every way that mattered. The Earl presided from his bath chair, drinking in the sight of his son and new daughter-in-law with undisguised joy. Neighbours offered congratulations that seemed genuine despite the scandal that had nearly erupted. Servants beamed as though the happiness of the household was their own. Honora sat beside Sebastian at the head of the table, still dazed by the morning's events. She was married. Actually, legally, irreversibly married. Lady Thornfield, Viscountess in her own right, mistress of an estate she had entered as a hired performer. The absurdity of it made her want to laugh. The reality of it made her want to weep. Sebastian's hand found hers beneath the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Are you well?" "I am overwhelmed," she admitted. "Is this truly happening?" "It is truly happening." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, uncaring of the watching guests. "You are my wife, my actual wife. I confess I am somewhat overwhelmed myself. A fine pair we make, the finest." He smiled a real smile, without sardonic edges or protective irony, and Honora felt her heart expand with something she barely recognized. Happiness. She was happy. The feast continued through the afternoon, but by evening the Earl's strength was fading rapidly. Sebastian carried him upstairs himself, refusing the assistance of footmen, and Honora followed to help settle him in his chambers. "Stay," the Earl whispered, gripping Sebastian's hand with surprising force. "Both of you, stay with me tonight." They stayed. Sebastian sat in a chair beside the bed while Honora perched on the edge, and the Earl talked rambling reminiscences of his youth, of his courtship of Sebastian's mother, of William's golden childhood and Sebastian's quieter one. He spoke of regrets and joys and the strange mixture of pride and sorrow that defined fatherhood. As midnight approached, his voice grew weaker, his pauses longer. "I am glad," he whispered finally. "So glad I lived to see this day. You will be happy together, I can feel it. You will give this old house the joy it has been missing." "Father," Sebastian's voice was rough. "Let me go, my boy." The Earl's eyes were closing. "I have seen what I needed to see. Let me go." Sebastian's composure cracked. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to his father's hand, and Honora saw his shoulders shake with silent sobs. "I love you, Father." "I know." The words were barely audible. "I have always known." The Earl of Blackmere died as the clock struck 1, with his son holding his hand and his new daughter-in-law reading softly from his favourite book of Psalms. His passing was peaceful, a gentle exhalation, a final relaxation of features that had been tight with pain for months, and in the silence that followed, Honora found herself weeping for a man she had known less than a week, but had somehow come to love. Sebastian did not move. He remained bent over his father's hand, his grief a palpable thing filling the room, and Honora did the only thing she could think of. She knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around him, holding him while he broke. They stayed that way until dawn. The days that followed were a blur of funeral preparations, legal consultations, and the endless logistics of death. Sebastian moved through it all with grim efficiency, his walls rebuilt, his emotions locked away behind a facade of competence. Honora watched him with growing concern. He was courteous to her, even affectionate, in his way, but something had withdrawn. The openness he had shown in the garden, the vulnerability of their wedding night, had retreated behind the old defences. She understood. Grief demanded space, and Sebastian had spent a decade avoiding strong feelings precisely because they hurt too much. His father's death had cracked open wounds he had never fully healed, and he was doing what he had always done, protecting himself through distance. But she could not let him retreat entirely. Not now. Not when they had only just begun. The funeral was held 3 days after the Earl's death, in the same chapel where they had married. The bishop presided, his voice heavy with genuine grief, and the entire county seemed to attend. Honora stood beside her husband in black silk, receiving condolences from strangers, playing the role of Viscountess with a composure that surprised even her. Harold did not appear. Word had reached them that he had departed for London the morning after the wedding, presumably to nurse his grievances in private. Sebastian had already instructed his solicitors to ensure that Harold received nothing beyond what the entail required, a modest quarterly allowance that would keep him comfortable but dependent. After the funeral, after the guests had departed and the household had retreated into morning quiet, Honora went looking for her husband. She found him in his father's chambers, sitting in the chair where he had kept vigil, staring at the empty bed with an expression of such desolation that her heart clenched. "Sebastian." He did not turn. "You should rest. These past days have been exhausting." "I have rested enough." She crossed to him and laid her hand on his shoulder. "It is you I am worried about." "I am fine." "You are not fine. You have barely eaten. You have not slept. You have spoken to me in nothing but practical matters since—" She stopped, unable to say the words. "Since my father died." His voice was flat. "You may say it. I am not so fragile that I cannot hear the truth." "I do not think you are fragile. I think you are grieving, and I think you are trying to grieve alone, which is unnecessary and perhaps unwise." Sebastian finally looked at her, and she saw the exhaustion in his features, the hollowness in his grey eyes. "I do not know how to do this, Honora. I have not allowed myself to feel anything deeply in 10 years. I thought when he finally passed, I thought I would be prepared. I thought I had already mourned him." "One cannot mourn the living." She knelt beside his chair, taking his cold hands in hers. "Your father is gone. Whatever grief you suppressed while he was ill, whatever feelings you pushed aside to care for him, they are demanding acknowledgement now." "I do not want to feel this. I know. I want to be the man I was before, cold, controlled, untouchable. I know. But I cannot be." His voice cracked. "Because of you. Because you came into this house and changed everything. And now I cannot retreat to numbness because you are here, and I love you, and loving you means feeling everything." Honora reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle on his stubbled cheek. "Then feel it. Feel the grief and the love and the fear and whatever else demands expression. I will be here. I am not going anywhere. You married a broken man. I married a man who is learning to be whole. There is a difference." Sebastian closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I miss him. God help me, but I miss him already." "I know. I miss him too. You knew him less than a week, and in that week he showed me more acceptance and warmth than I had known in years." She smiled despite her own tears. "He loved you so much, Sebastian. All he wanted was your happiness. And now," she gestured to herself, "you have it, or the beginning of it at least." Sebastian pulled her up and into his arms, holding her with desperate strength. "Stay with me. Through this, through whatever comes next. I cannot do this alone." "You will never have to." She pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heart beat beneath her cheek. "I made vows, remember? For better or worse. This is the worse. The better will come." They held each other in the darkening room while the sun set over Ashworth Hall, and somewhere in the midst of grief and exhaustion and the strange peace of shared sorrow, they began the work of building a life together. The following weeks brought the slow rhythm of mourning and adjustment. Sebastian assumed his new responsibilities as Earl of Blackmere, a title that fit him awkwardly at first, like an inherited coat cut for a different body. There were tenants to meet, accounts to review, a crumbling estate to restore. Honora threw herself into supporting him, discovering a talent for household management she had not known she possessed. Her mother arrived at Ashworth Hall a fortnight after the funeral, transported by a private carriage Sebastian had arranged. Dr. Shaw accompanied her, having agreed to oversee her treatment in the country air that he declared far superior to London's soot and noise. Eleanor Blackwell was too weak to be surprised by her daughter's transformation from impoverished spinster to countess. She simply smiled when Honora explained, leaving out the more scandalous details, and said, "I always knew you would find your way, darling. You were always the strong one." The treatment began immediately, and within weeks, Eleanor showed improvement that exceeded all expectations. The consumption had not been as advanced as feared, Dr. Shaw reported, and with proper care and rest, she might live many years yet. The bishop departed for London after the funeral, but not before extracting a promise from Honora and Sebastian to visit him when they came to town. "I expect to see you both at Easter services," he said sternly, "looking properly married and disgustingly happy." "We shall do our best," Sebastian replied, and the faint smile on his lips suggested that disgustingly happy might not be beyond reach. Spring came slowly to Derbyshire, but when it arrived, it transformed Ashworth Hall. The gardens that had been neglected burst into glorious bloom, tended now by an army of gardeners Sebastian had hired at Honora's suggestion. The house itself underwent repairs and renovations, its faded grandeur slowly restored to something approaching its former glory. And in the midst of it all, Honora discovered that she was with child. She told Sebastian on a May evening, in the rose garden his mother had planted, beneath a sky streaked with pink and gold. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and she felt a flutter of fear that she had somehow miscalculated. Then he swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing with a joy she had never heard from him before. "A child," he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "Our child. An heir for Ashworth Hall. Or an heiress. We cannot know yet. I do not care. Boy or girl, it makes no difference." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I thought I would never have this. Never wanted it, after William. A family seemed like too great a risk, too much to lose. And now? Now I cannot imagine anything else." He kissed her softly. "You have given me everything, Honora. Everything I did not know I needed. You have given me the same." She touched his face, marveling at how familiar it had become. "I came here expecting nothing but a transaction. Instead, I found a home, a family, a future." She smiled. "And a husband who, despite his best efforts, turned out to be rather wonderful. Wonderful is overstating it. Tolerable, then. Occasionally bearable." He laughed and kissed her again, and the roses bloomed around them, and somewhere in the house, Eleanor Blackwell was playing pianoforte while Mrs. Bradley hummed along, and everything that had seemed impossible 6 months ago had somehow become beautifully, improbably real. 8 years later, the annual Christmas gathering at Ashworth Hall had become a tradition, spoken of throughout the county as the event of the season. The great house blazed with candles, its halls decked with holly and ivy, its kitchens producing feasts that rivaled anything London could offer. Honora moved through the crowded drawing room, greeting guests and directing servants with the ease of long practice. She had grown into her role as Countess of Blackmere, no longer the awkward merchant's daughter playing a part, but a woman of genuine authority and warmth. 3 children had contributed to her transformation. James, the eldest at 7, bore his grandfather's name and his father's grey eyes. Catherine, 5, had her mother's auburn hair and her grandmother Eleanor's gentle temperament. And little William, named for the uncle he would never know, was just 3. A whirlwind of energy who kept the entire household in constant motion. Eleanor herself sat in the corner, surrounded by admirers, her health remarkably robust for a woman who had once seemed destined for an early grave. Dr. Shaw visited twice yearly and pronounced her constitution stronger than most women half her age. The bishop had arrived that morning, his hair entirely silver now, but his eyes as sharp as ever. He was leading James through a complicated theological discussion about whether Father Christmas counted as a saint, while Catherine practiced her curtsies on the vicar's wife, and William attempted to climb the Christmas tree. "William, down this instant!" Honora caught her youngest before he could topple the tree and its hundreds of candles. He squirmed in her arms, laughing, entirely unrepentant.
"Papa said I could reach the star." "Papa said nothing of the kind." Sebastian appeared at her side, lifting William from her arms with practiced ease. "I said you could help put the star on the tree, which we did together, using a ladder, like civilized people." "Ladders are boring. Ladders are safe. Climbing trees indoors is not." Sebastian ruffled his son's hair and set him down. "Go find your sister. I believe she is attempting to teach the vicar's wife to polka." William raced off, and Sebastian drew Honora aside to a quiet corner where they could observe the chaos without being consumed by it. "Are you well?" he asked, his hand resting on the small swell of her belly, their 4th child, expected in late spring. "You have been on your feet all day." "I am perfectly well. I have borne 3 children and managed this household for 8 years. I believe I can survive a Christmas party." "You could survive anything." He kissed her temple. "That is what I love about you." "Only that?" "Also your wit, your wisdom, your stubbornness, your tendency to tell me when I am being an idiot." "Which is often." "Which is often," he agreed. "And your completely unreasonable insistence that I learn to feel things." Honora smiled, leaning into him. "You were a very poor student at first." "I had an excellent teacher." His arm tightened around her. "I was thinking today about how we began. A business arrangement, you called it. £50 for a week of deception." "I remember. I did not expect to love you." His voice grew soft. "I did not expect to love anyone." And now, he gestured to the room full of family and friends, to their children causing cheerful havoc, to the life they had built together. "Now I cannot imagine existing any other way." "Neither can I." Honora turned to face him fully. "You know, when I first accepted your proposal, the real one, in the garden I was terrified. I thought I was making a terrible mistake. Marrying a stranger for love seemed like the height of foolishness. And now I know it was the wisest thing I have ever done." She touched his face, tracing the lines that 8 years had added lines of laughter, mostly, rather than the grief and coldness that had marked him when they met. "You have given me everything, Sebastian. A home, a family, a purpose. But more than that, you have given me yourself. And that is worth more than any fortune." He caught her hand and pressed his lips to her palm. "I love you, Honora.
more than I ever thought possible.
I know, she smiled. I love you too.
From across the room, James called out that Grandfather Bishop was telling the story of how Papa and Mama met, and could they come listen? William was already climbing onto the bishop's lap, and Catherine was demanding to know if there were any princesses in the story. Sebastian and Honora exchanged glances, half amused, half alarmed. The bishop's version of events tends to be rather unvarnished, Sebastian said. Then perhaps we should provide editorial oversight. They crossed the room together, hand in hand, to join their family around the fire. The bishop paused in his narrative as they approached. Ah, the happy couple themselves. Children, did I tell you that your mother was very brave when she first came to Ashworth Hall? She was afraid, but she faced her fears and did what she believed was right. Was Papa brave too? Catherine asked. The bishop considered. Your father was learning to be brave. Your mother helped him. I thought the man was supposed to save the lady, James said dubiously. Sometimes, Sebastian said, settling onto the sofa and pulling William onto his lap. The lady saves the man, and sometimes they save each other. That's what happened with you and Mama? That is exactly what happened. Sebastian met Honora's eyes across the children's heads, and in his gaze she saw everything, the desperation that had brought them together, the deception that had nearly destroyed them, the love that had transformed them both. Your mother saved me, and I have spent every day since trying to deserve her. Do you deserve her yet? William asked seriously. Sebastian smiled. Not yet, but I am still trying. Honora reached across the children to take his hand. You deserve me, she said quietly. You always did. The firelight flickered, casting warm shadows across the room full of people they loved. Outside, snow had begun to fall, blanketing Ashworth Hall in white, making the ancient house look like something from a fairy tale. Once upon a time, a man who needed a fake wife had found a woman who needed money. Neither of them had expected to find love, or family, or a happiness so profound it still surprised them daily. But they had found it nonetheless, and they lived, as the best stories promise, happily ever after.